If your IGCSE History Paper 1 is looming and your notes aren't up to scratch, then these revision videos are just what you need. In them, you will find key discussion points unpacked with carefully picked major content examples. All of it is illustrated through maps, diagrams, photographs, and cartoons. Enjoy! This photograph, in fact, of the village of Passchendaele, which is Belgium, it's not France, but it's the best photo we have of aerial view of just how destructive warfare was, how it could literally destroy every standing building. And so consequently, Clemenceau was very clear that that had to be paid for in blood. France, of course, lost almost 1.4 million men. You can see here its casualty rate at 25% of soldiers aged between 18 to 30 was very, very high. So relating to the damage that the Germans had done, financial and to human life, came the third French priority, which was to reduce German military power. Now, Clemenceau actually favoured complete demilitarisation of Germany. If he had had his way, he would have had the entire German army abolished. So he was the more extreme of the three on reducing Germany's military power to prevent a repetition of 1871 and 1914. Why was Wilson's organisation, for example, not accepted by the Americans? I mean, this cartoon is very instructive. Here we have a ship, and it's called the ship of the United States, so it symbolises America. And it has to try to steer clear of these dangers, foreign treaties, foreign entanglements. And you can see the League of Nations is also seen as a kind of a danger, an iceberg to the United States. And so the Americans, and this is crucial for the future of the League of Nations, the Americans just took the view that if they joined this international organization, they could be drawn back into the kind of conflict that they'd had to fight in 1917 and 1918. And members of the American public wanted to forget about World War I. They wanted to get on with their lives in the 1920s, free from being entangled in the chronic problems of Europe. Now, with the Americans absent, this cartoon famously depicts the consequences of the absence of America, America being the keystone, the final stone you put in the bridge to make it secure, the bridge that's so necessary to allow movement and freedom and passage across, if you like, the chasms or the big divides that make war possible. America's the keystone, but the Americans are not going to join the club. In January 1923, Belgian and French troops invaded. They went to go and get the goods in payment themselves. With the consequence, Germany suffered a terrible hyperinflation, which ultimately, indirectly, led to the popularity of groups like the Communists and the Nazis. And by 1932, of course, Hitler had formed a party that won the election of 1932 and ultimately achieved power. So to sum up, consequence number two is that the peace treaties create a financial meltdown in Germany that it's very hard to recover from. Indeed, it was made worse by the Great Depression, which started with the Wall Street crash in America in 1929 and then escalated. Now, of course, this slide that shows how the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan gave large loans to Germany so that Germany could then pay its reparations to France, who in turn then owed money to America. This slide demonstrates a rather lethal financial dependence on America. But the imagery, this muscular worker smashing the chains that are binding the world, or here on the right, Lenin sweeping away the moneymakers and kings and priests of the capitalist world from the face of the earth. This shows the ideology of international socialism. That is, only once the world is fully communist will the revolution's work be complete. So, moving on to 1941, this is the year that brought the two together. Hitler launched his massive invasion of the Soviet Union alongside his allies, Hungary, Romania, and others. And at the end of 1941, Japan attacked the USA at Pearl Harbor, and Hitler declared war on the USA 4 days later. So now the Russian and American fates were intertwined. This was why this meeting at Tehran was called. He ordered 80,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese fighters in January 1968 to infiltrate the main city centres of South Vietnam, disguised as farmers, officials, women, even policemen. And then undercover, from the sound of fireworks going off on the 30th of January all around the country, these irregular forces would launch surprise attacks in over 100 cities and towns. They carried out wholesale executions of puppets of the Americans, their nickname, of course, for the officials who served the South Vietnamese government. And most spectacularly of all, Giap's fighters even managed to briefly capture the US embassy in Saigon. Now, the American backlash and the backlash of the South Vietnamese army, which we'll call the ARVN, as you remember, the ARVN and the American backlash was ferocious and it was deadly. This photograph of General Loan executing an arrested Viet Cong fighter became very famous. And note, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese lost over 45,000 men and women in the Tet. But the point we were making was this: Giap wanted to prove that the Viet Cong and the Viet Minh of the North remained undefeated and still in belief that they could drive the Americans out. I think the Tet offensive proved more than that. It probably proved that they were undefeatable. Certainly the incoming president, the Republican Richard Nixon, believed so. Other areas of the Soviet-controlled system, for example, the Baltic states that were formerly within the USSR, they were well aware that these concessions had been made. The Gdansk Agreement would have been published all over the communist world. But this cartoon shows Brezhnev desperately trying to stop the other states in the Soviet bloc from looking at what was happening and unfolding in Poland. So this was embarrassing for Brezhnev's regime. You will see that this next cartoon gives an interesting idea. Lech Walesa was just an ordinary working man. All he was asking for were the sorts of rights that Marx said workers should demand. Therefore, if the Polish government was going against solidarity, the Polish government was going against its own Marxist principles. The Soviets appointed a hardliner, General Jaruzelski, to deal with solidarity and the challenge it posed. So how does the war end? By 1988, in fact, Saddam had won back the Al-Faw Peninsula. And then on the 3rd of July, 1988, an Iranian flight 655 was shot down by an American anti-aircraft missile. That the captain mistakenly thought that it was an Iranian fighter jet about to attack one of his convoys. But it had this effect. The Ayatollah, who by this stage was an old man, who realized that the war was almost certainly unwinnable in the terms that he had in mind, the Ayatollah can now turn to his population and say, look, we're fighting the Americans. And this then gives him the opportunity to climb down. The Ayatollah agrees to the UN ceasefire agreement. And here they are. This is UN Resolution 598, accepted by Iran and Iraq in July of 1988.